Now, a cyclist who collided with a pensioner could not be prosecuted because speed limits don't apply to bicycles. The man was going 29 miles an hour. He was doing timed laps around Regent's Park in London, and he hit 81-year-old Hilda Griffiths as she crossed the road as she was trying to reach a pedestrian island. So the legal speed limit there is 20 miles an hour, and 59 days after the accident, Miss Griffiths died from head injury complications. So we are encouraged to cycle more and more, aren't we? But the law apparently seems to have failed to keep up with the dangers that bikes pose to pedestrians. What do you think, Scarlett? Are you a cyclist?
I'm a slow cyclist. I will never, ever be done for speeding, and I don't bicycle that much anymore. But what I find odd about this story is that I remember, I mean, it was years ago, a cyclist being done in Cambridge in the middle of the night for exceeding the speed limit, and he too was trying to race. I mean, I think the big problem with cyclists, so there were two problems. One is this guy was obviously, he was in a peloton. There was a whole bunch of them that were obviously trying to practice for racing. I mean, I think it was at something like 7 a.m. But the terrible problem, if you're trying to cross the road, is you don't hear them. I mean,
that's right.
I mean, that's what happened to this woman, is that clearly, like I do quite often, you know, she went across the road, didn't look properly, and bang. And I think had he been going at under 20, I mean, of course, you know, cyclists should stick to the speed limit. Of course, there should be a speed limit, but most cyclists do not go over 20 miles an hour.
So, although you can't be done for speeding, because that's got to be only motorised vehicles, cyclists can be fined for wanton and furious cycling. If bodily harm is inflicted on someone due to cycling, you can get a 2-year prison sentence. Most cyclists that I see are cycling, I would say, as wanton and furiously.
I think in London, certainly, there is a culture around cycling where actually a lot of people do not behave particularly courteously, shall we say. Every day I see people jumping red lights, always cyclists, always men, it must be said, never women that I see doing, always men of a certain age.
Normally wearing lycra.
Oh, yes. Do you know what, actually, having got very upset about the generalisations of certain people earlier, I'm happy to generalise this kind of cyclist, because we all know who it is that we're talking about. I think the motorised vehicle thing, I get why that exists, but I do think it's about, well, it's a simple question of velocity, actually. It doesn't matter if you're riding a horse or riding a bike or whatever it is. If you're going at a certain speed and you hit somebody point blank, you're going to cause a lot of damage. So it does apply to other road users based simply on the fact that they are road users. It should apply to all. I don't think that it's a very fair thing. And as we say, there is a culture. Look, we wouldn't tolerate boy races in the middle of London like we do, these cyclists. And I do think, actually, it's about time, simply because of the general culture around cycling that I see, certainly in the capital city. I know that, you know, it might be different elsewhere in the countryside. I know it's, you know, perfectly fine to go at sort of 30, 40 miles an hour because you're probably not going to come into contact with a lot of people. But in those kind of built-up urban areas, actually, yeah, I think you probably should have to obey
but how do you police that then? Then we're starting to go down the route of, well, cyclists therefore should have a registration plate, or they should be wearing something which identifies them.
This person was prosecuted, so there was no question that he was identified. I mean, the whole problem.
But he was in, like you say, he was in a peloton. He was in a group that were training for an event. If you are a cyclist and you run over an old lady, you can just cycle away, and no one's ever going to know who you are.
Yeah, but I know. I mean, a friend of mine who was on her way to interview President Obama was run down by a cyclist and ended up in hospital and didn't do the interview with Obama. So she was pretty bitter about it, I can tell you. And technically, he wasn't breaking the law. I mean, she was crossing the road. And he thought that shouting at her was good enough, and she just assumed it was her husband.
But there's so much fury and anger on the roads now.
But I mean,
cars versus bikes.
But right there, that's a sort of opportunities to interview the President of the United States do not come along very often. Not that that should be the thing that sort of determines, but it can ruin your day, it can ruin your life, it can kill you. Ultimately, the end result of it is the same. So, you know, whilst I don't think we do want to go down the route of, you know, saying, have you got a licence for this bike and having registration plates and all that, if people can't behave a certain way, ultimately there will, I think, be more tolerance of government getting involved and saying, well, hang on, no, if enough people are misbehaving, then that's what's going to happen. And so you do have to kind of turn around to people and say, well, look, if you don't want this to happen, maybe don't behave a certain way whilst you're cycling along, because you will ruin it for yourselves and for everybody else.
But who is this cycle culture for? Because it's been subsequent governments. It's not just a Sadiq Khan issue, although he has clearly pushed this through and he loves it. It started with Boris Johnson, actually, and his Boris bikes.
Yeah, but we're talking about different sorts. There are 3 different sorts of cyclists that we've discussed on this programme. There's the peloton, and they were clearly racing. It was at 7 a.m.
Yeah. They were in a park.
They were in Regent's Park.
Yeah.
They were going round the inner circle, or the outer circle, and they were training. So we're not talking about the people Benedict is talking about. These were people training, and tragically,
there should have been some sort of safeguard in place in that situation. I mean, somebody, a marshal or somebody watching.
Something, and I think they probably thought that at 7 a.m. it was okay.
Yeah.
Then there's the boring cyclists like me, and there are an awful lot of us who just bicycle. And frankly, the man who mowed down my friend was a boring, ordinary cyclist. And then there are. I'm more sympathetic to the Deliveroo people because at least they're working. But there are the people Benedict's talking about who are just an absolute pain in the arse. Whether you are a pedestrian or I mean, as a cyclist, I do find other cyclists can be dangerous.
Benedict, one of our viewers, Livy, has got in touch and said this country has paid a fortune for bike lanes and so the cyclists should pay some kind of licence and insurance. Surely they insure them for theft. Because I was thinking that if you are a pedestrian hit by a cyclist and you can't work again, you've got no insurance.
Well, it's not an unfair point, actually. Again, well, you can sue them, but actually...
If you can find them, you can sue them.
But I think, again, people who have other kinds of vehicles, you can't drive them legally without some sort of insurance. So maybe if you don't necessarily need a licence or a registration plate, maybe some sort of insurance would be good. But you should be taking that out anyway on yourself at the very least, because actually bikes do get stolen a lot. People do get into accidents when it comes to... But, the proliferation of cycling in this country, I think it comes... First and foremost, it comes because a lot of the politicians who go onto high office went to Oxford and Cambridge, and there's a lot of cycling there. So they think, this works for everybody. They go to Europe, and a lot of the cities are a lot smaller than our post-industrial cities, and they think you can cycle everywhere in Bologna or Amsterdam. Wonderful. Everybody should do this. And also, it's you've sort of... Scarlett's pointed out that there are several different types of cyclist. Actually, when it comes to commuting, it tends to be a young person without many strings, don't have children or anything like that. They don't actually have to cycle long distances. So it's useful for a certain kind of person, the sort of person who might want to live within, say, cycling distance of Westminster in central London. Yeah. It's the sort of thing that certain people think, this is very good. It's not the most practical thing to roll out nationwide. You know who it's
terrible for? Parents. This obsession with cycling is a nightmare for parents. And that's why I think that these male politicians...
Bev, why?
Why? Because my day looks like getting the kids from school with a boot full of supermarket shopping, taking one to a netball team, or taking one to a swimming club. If we want our children to do activities, we need to live in a city where we've either got amazing public transport and we do not have it. But even if we had amazing public transport, we as parents can't give our children the life that they need, and grandparents, whilst we're told to get on bikes in the rain on a cold day.
No, nobody's telling you to get on.
They are. If you can't,
come on, you have a choice.
You don't have a choice. That's my point. Is you don't have a choice.
Bev,
you don't have a choice.
You've just told me you have a car, right?
Yes.
You have a car
Couldn't
and you
live
drive.
without it.
That's absolutely fine. And you drive your children places, so you have a choice. I don't have a car. I have a choice. I have a choice because actually where I live there is good public transport, and for my east-west things I take my bike. We have a choice. Of course, children. I mean, and actually I taught my kids how to ride a bike. I mean, I presume you have too.
No. Yeah, of course they can ride a bike. Of course they can. But I wouldn't want them going out in London. I wouldn't. My eldest does ride an electric bike now, and it's because he can't barely afford public transport. So it's so expensive.
Yes.
So he goes out, but I will not encourage my daughters to ride bicycles in London. Not at all. And when they're teenagers, maybe it's okay. But actually, when they're younger, when you want to get them to their activities, how are you meant to do that on a bike?
Oh, well, then that's fine. You drive them. I mean, nobody's saying that.
But then with low traffic neighbourhoods, with all the cycle lanes, which means it's bumper to bumper to bumper, it takes hours to get anywhere in this city now. And so, who's suffering?
Part of the problem is, I think we're talking a lot about cities. Well, no, very rarely people actually ever talk about is the countryside, where still half of the population live.
Yeah.
It's much safer to ride a bike in the countryside, but it takes you a lot longer to get to anywhere that you want to go. And that's actually where, you know, the concentration of motor vehicle users, if you want to use them, is most important, because also public transport isn't very... Where I'm from, if you want to get to the nearest city, there is one every hour. It does not always come exactly on the hour, and if you miss it, well, good luck, you've got to wait for the next one. And they've cut back on those services.
Although, actually, I would say, if you're in Devon or some places where I was brought up, cycling is not safe.
No, and it's not even an option. Yeah, very good point.